Our next talk is from Henrietta Ross, titled Subjective Objects, Data Visualization and Physicalisation Practice on MA Design for Data Visualization. And so we're coming back into the world of physical data visualization, which is exciting. And I'm excited to welcome Henrietta up to the stage to get plugged in to deliver her talk. Welcome.
Okay, I'm not sure about the clicker, so I'm just going to go manual. Is that a bit loud? Is that okay? We're all right. Great. Hello, my name is Henrietta Ross, and I'm the course leader on MA Data Visualization, and I'm going to talk to you today about data physicalisation and visceralisation practices on the course. So I think it's important to begin just with a little bit of a context and touching on where it is we're coming from on the course to data visualization practices. So our course is based within London College of Communication, which is part of University of the Arts London. So we're a single subject art and design institution, and within that, we on the MA Data Visualization course are really based within the graphic communication design program. So we're really bringing that graphic design approach to data visualization practice. And I think that informs a lot of the ways in which we work and a lot of the ideas and concepts which I'll be touching on today. So what do we mean by data physicalisation and visceralisation in the context of the course? So these are three projects which I think, really interestingly reflect that practice. And they also, this collection, shows some of the directions that we're exploring with this approach. So on the far side, we've got a project by Carla, where she's using large-scale installation, which almost kind of rejects a move towards abstraction, using the actual artifacts talked of in the data to create this installation that people can walk around and investigate further through the use of auxiliary information via QR codes. In the center, we've got a project that's, I think, a really interesting example of more visceralization practice. This is a data soap project produced by Clarice on the course last year. And this is offering the opportunity to not only touch and smell the data, but also have almost an evolving relationship with it in the context of use of the artifact. Finally, on the closest side here, we've got an image of Carolina's work from a few years ago, where she was really interested in subjectivity and the partial nature of much data and data sets. So she created these data textiles, which shift and change and allow us only a particular perspective on the data and the data visualization we're engaging with. So the good question is, why have we got all my icons? Sorry about that. Hope we can just see beyond them to the main image. But why data physicalization and visceralization? Why are we interested in this approach? So for me, this is quite a good starting point for this conversation, this discussion. To me, in the context of graphic design practice, this is quite a typical example of work that we produce and, something we very much celebrate within the course. We really encourage participants to be engaging with, producing work of this nature throughout their time on the program. And I think there's a lot to be celebrated in this example, which comes from a project from Bo Gao from a few years ago. There's excellent deployment here of things like color, the treatment of marks and attributes, position, shape, typography, typographic hierarchy. It's really working effectively to engage with the reader, the user, and convey to them a particular insight about this data set. But I think the other thing we've got to acknowledge about work like this is the way that it can be described as a particular trope within data visualization practice, the complex circle behind glass. And I think while this can be extremely appropriate and effective in certain circumstances, we've also got to recognize perhaps some of the problematic implications of this type of visual language and its deployment. Because what we see here is an extremely rational visual language which conveys a strong sense of objectivity about the data. And I think those of us who are frequently working with data are more than well aware of the way it's so often messy, partial, untidy, and the narratives and stories that we can tell with it are so frequently determined by the way in which it's been collected, organized, shared, and so many of the decisions around that are entirely opaque. So presentations like this arguably really belie that context and give us a sense of a data world that is perfect, a godlike view, as Donna Haraway described. And I think the other thing that the complex circles behind glass tropes can sometimes do is to create quite a space, a distance between the visualization, the output, and the reader. So arguably, with outputs like this, the reader becomes the passive consumer of information that's defined by the designer or other creators. And I think, contemporary debates around data in particular are really focusing on the way in which we need to become much more active, critical consumers and actors with a data context that we all inevitably live within. So arguably, these types of presentations maybe miss an opportunity to create more critical, active data readers among us, their audiences. So we're by no means the only people who are looking at work and ideas around this area. We've heard about some of them this morning. I think, there are lots of interesting practice looking at this work, but one of the key points of reference that we're constantly returning to on the course when we think about this type of making is from Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio, who highlight how they encourage us to engage critically with the emphasis on neutrality in visualization practice and explore alternatives to this in order to rebalance the hierarchy over reason over emotion in data visualization. I think in addition to this, looking at physicalisation and visceralisation can increase the accessibility of our outputs and our making, so thinking beyond just a visual emphasis in our communication design. They can acknowledge and reflect messy, partial, and incomplete data. They can reflect multiple perspectives and highlight missing data, and also embody the situated nature of our work and the biases, compromises, and perspectives we inevitably bring to our making. So what are some examples of this type of work and practice, the interrogation of these ideas on the course? So this is a piece of work that was produced on the course last year by a group of 4 participants who were responding to a collaborative brief that we defined with the International Detention Coalition. So this was a project that was about migration, and using Blender, the participants propose this large-scale installation, which I think is interesting for the way in which it encourages the reader to walk through this data about migration, thereby attempting to kind of resist that temptation to revert to pure abstraction that we do still see in the kind of the column chart that this visualization is essentially based on. But an attempt is made to really situate that data in its context, not only with the inclusion of movement, but these kind of curved tubes at the top of those columns are used to produce a smellscape based on the regional context of this data, and then so hopefully retain that situated context from where it comes. I think another project that interestingly does this that I touched on earlier is Carolina's from a few years ago. And her research work that she did as part of her final project was really focused around this idea of the way in which often with a single data set, we can define multiple narratives that even sometimes might be used to make contradictory arguments. So she produced these data textiles on which she printed these data visualization pieces. And these, when they're kind of worn, as some of these garments might be, again, they show us this partial and particular perspectives. They really highlight the subjectivity of much data visualization work. Again, this output was proposed as part of a larger installation in which the data textiles sit in a center of a three-dimensional space surrounded by more conventional data visualizations that allow the user, the reader, to interrogate further the possible narratives that could be surfaced with that single data set. Carla's work, again from last year on the course, uses embodiment and large-scale data installation with the actual objects or artifacts that the data is based around. So with this, Carla was looking at the import and homegrown fruit and vegetable consumption in the UK. And she resists the temptation to represent this with abstract forms and instead creates this large scale, at length, this is 3+ meters tall, installation with the fruits and the vegetables, the artifacts themselves. One of the things I really like about this outcome is it's quite playful. It's visually enticing and it engages the audience in the subject, which, when we utilize the QR codes on the labels in the floor section, leads us on to more in-depth information on the implications of global supply chains and networks. But I think it's effective to combine those surprising and delightful, those more playful elements with perhaps some of these more in-depth insights into data contexts. I think this is also true of Clarice's work, again from last year, the Data Soap project, where Clarice was looking at water inequality in the context of the UK and water shortage. She spent a long time at the beginning of the project really focusing on quantitative understandings of this context and getting a broad spectrum view of the issues around this particular topic. But towards the end of the project, she wanted to interrogate, to explore the lived experience of some of this issue, and so paired that with more qualitative research methods, focusing on interviews with individuals. And she then created these data soaps to manifest, to physicalize those insights from those interviews. But again, they're used to lead people on to that more quantitative understanding of the broader issue at hand through the supplementary information wrapped around those soaps. But again, they've got that sort of sense of playfulness, but again, enhancing that idea of subjectivity and our shifting perspectives on data when the soaps themselves are used by readers and obviously shift and changing, highlighting different data points in the context of their use. So these are just a few of the ways in which participants have explored these ideas on the course. In the last year, we've also had handheld physicalizations based around space data. We've had projects around cotton production and global supply chains using T-shirts and T-shirt appendages. And we've also had wind chimes based on collected sound data in the urban environment. But I think it would be nice to just briefly touch on the ways in which in the course we're kind of supporting these practices and kind of encouraging people to interrogate them as part of their work on the program. So this is roughly what the course looks like. But I think the core elements with which we explore these ideas are the first 2 units on the course. So the green, which is visualization, research and practices, and is almost like a critical and theoretical unit where we look at lots of texts, we hear from practitioners, and we have these seminars to discuss the ideas articulated in the literature and discourse around the subject. But below that, what we have is Unit 2, which is our visualization tools, data sets, and data stories units, where the participants are introduced to and bring their own interests in different tools, technologies, media and materials. But I think what's really interesting for me is when the participants are using that visualization tools, data sets, and data stories units to interrogate, pull apart, and define their own critical positions in response to the ideas that we're exploring in Unit 1. And for me, this kind of interrogation, the movement between different positions, arguments, and ideas is quite nicely encapsulated by these 2 quotes, which is by no means the extent of the literature that we look at. But I think, Edward Tufte's entreaty to above all else show the data is really interesting when we juxtapose that with Georgia Lupi's claim that we are ready to question the impersonality of a merely technical approach to data and begin designing ways to connect numbers to what they really stand for: knowledge, behavior, people. And I see physicalisation and visceralisation a really interesting way to navigate these territories and to find a situated practice that sits between them. One final point or way in which I think we further support this work is through what we call the collaborative unit. So this is where we define a brief in collaboration with an external partner, which has included people like UN Women, the Red Cross, St George's Hospital in London Bridge in recent years. And what we do is ask the participants to work in small groups to respond to these briefs. But at the same time, we ask them to produce 2 projects simultaneously. One of them is very much aligned to the stated aims and requirements of the partner. And then the second brief, we ask them to respond to these ideas around an emphasis on a rational visual language in data visualization and attempt to, in some ways, subvert that. So they produce often these physicalized, large-scale outputs which touch on these visceralization, physicalization directions. And I think the thing that's kind of remarkable to me about these projects is the way that, again, the partners that we work on are so frequently surprised and delighted by these outputs. And I think this is quite an interesting space that academia arguably offers. It's an opportunity to perhaps think beyond the immediate demands and requirements of a commercial professional context and maybe kind of do a problem finding as well as a problem solving exercise as part of our collaborative practice. So a little more kind of applied in terms of the way in which we work in this space on the course. So much of our work is inevitably very much focused on laptops or other computers with greater processing power. It's working with software, spreadsheet, some coding and programming. But I think, when we have the opportunity to explore with making beyond the most obvious technical tools and often beyond traditional forms of mark making, I think that's often where a lot of, for me, the real exciting work on the course happens. So, some of these are inspired by existing projects. So a nod here with the helium balloon workshop to, again, domestic data streamers practice. Some of them are more successful than others. Don't think we'll be repeating the toast workshop, bit of a fire risk there. But again, these activities are endlessly surprising, and apart from anything else, they're really fun. They're really fun, engaging, participatory activities on the course. And I think retaining the joy and the element of discovery in our practice really is something that we want to retain as a core and central part of our work. So briefly, I thought I'd touch on, what next with this area of practice. I think one of the strengths of it is that it's not defined, and a lot of our work in this area is designed to support the interrogation of unexpected territories. But I think one of the things that we've been noting with participants more recently on the course is while a lot of the projects we've looked at are focused around a sense of interaction and activation of the reader at the end point. Increasingly, participants are looking at ways of integrating the reader's interaction at the origin point of the visualization work, often using coding and programming tools. But I think it would be really interesting if we could bring more of an emphasis on physicalisation and visceralisation into that origin point in a collaborative setting with readers at the start and the making of these projects. In addition, I'm personally really interested in large-scale participatory data visualisation as research method, as we can see in these central images here. And I think it would be very interesting to explore the way in which we could leverage the joy, the excitement, the fun and the playfulness of data physicalisation and visceralisation to some of these activities. Thank you.
Hi, Henrietta.
Hi, Andy.
Hi, good to see you again. So the first one is there'll be a question formed out of these words. I'm not sure what it is yet, but it picks up on the theme from your talk and Shirley's about materials, fabrics, acrylics, soap. And it feels like there's almost a need for a part of these programs to have a degree of chemists coming along to tell you how different compounds work and how different materials work with each other and how they decay over time, how they react to light, and it just opens up a whole new line of knowledge that we have to build in and learn ourselves. So how do the students handle that sort of research of how an object responds to different material components? And then the second question is just linked to that. I love the data soap idea. I'm just wondering, did that soap smell? Did it have a fragrance? And to what extent do you think about the kind of olfactory senses as another extension of sort of visceralisation, perhaps?
Lovely, thank you. I think the first part of the question about, how do we support a really informed and effective practice around working with new and perhaps unfamiliar materials is a really interesting one. I think sounds like there's an excellent PhD in that. Fantastic. But I think also at LCC, we are really fortunate that we work not only with academic members of staff, but fantastic technical teams. So lots of different technical areas, from creative computing to 3D workshop to printmaking to fabrication. So I think, collaboration is probably key to, making really exciting discoveries in that area and working alongside and in partnership with experts, I think could be really fruitful and really interesting. I've forgotten the second question now, I'm sorry.
These pairs of
The
questions
soap
are really
and the fragrance and the use of smell.
Yes,
Yeah.
it did smell. To be honest, I think, Clarice, excellent practitioner, she determined to, dominate the world of soap making from 0 to 100 in the space of a few weeks. So I'm not sure if she totally nailed all of the properties of soap making. And I think, the final product was a bit of a one stage in the journey, but definitely the intention, the expectation it would be that kind of multi-sensory experience, which I think is a really interesting area of work, that kind of smellscapes, which is explored really effectively by Kate McLean, who is another friend of the course who's done fantastic work, also PhD on sensory mapping, which, as you say, I think is a fascinating area of practice.
Soap is curious too because it feels temporary, right?
Yes.
You can use it up.
Yeah.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, down here in front. Or sorry, let's go to the back, in the back corner. Yes.
I was wondering, for more like vanilla uses of data, if you're helping a business understand its user base, how can you bring in principles of data visualization into that kind of context where you need quick iteration and maybe something portable?
Right.
Like,
Well, I mean, I do think 3D rendering tools are extremely useful in this practice. Obviously, they're not necessarily super fast and quick if you're not familiar with them. There's a bit of a steep learning curve there. But I think, sketching, mocking up, whether that's in a kind of hand-drawn, crafted way or using more digital tools, can be a really effective avenue. And yeah, I think kind of working at small scale can be really interesting. I think often what kind of pushes people who might not be expecting a kind of physicalisation or visceralisation output is to sometimes situate the making in a familiar context that they know well. So if you position it in, say, a venue that they either use frequently or is aligned with their discipline, and see how it might work in that context of use. Sometimes that's quite an effective way to kind of bring people with you to see how this might be a really interesting element of their work around communication design.
Well, and picks up on, I think, your point on research too, right? How do you use this as a research tool, which is a fascinating additional space for exploration around that as an ethnographic or design tool. We're going to take two more questions, one up here in the front from our audience online, and then one more in the center, and we'll go ahead and wrap up this session.
It's an online question from Dylan Omran. They ask, are there different or extra accessibility challenges for physical visualizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, there's an interesting kind of, there's an interesting combination of issues happening around accessibility. So I think there's an accessibility opportunity when we kind of think and move beyond a purely visual presentation that perhaps lives on screen. But I think, we do open up, a Pandora's box of complexity, when we, design things that are site-specific and attempt to kind of utilize and engage people with a variety of different senses. We do need to kind of think that through in an increasingly complex way. But I think, like the last presenter highlighted, maybe it's a focus on kind of user testing, of working with readers who are bringing to engagements with visualization lots of different kind of abilities. And perhaps kind of that sort of co-design element needs to be really integrated in a lot of these concepts when they're realized, in order to try and make them, to utilize that accessibility point as far as we can.
And then last up front, our last question go ahead, for this session, and then we'll move into our final part of the morning.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Amelia Ruzica. I was wondering, for somebody who isn't a part of one of these master's programs, but is really interested in getting involved with, data physicalisation, data visceralisation, has experimented in the past, what are some of the things you would recommend in terms of getting access to resources and sort of getting the physical space to do the physical things?
Yeah, I know, it is a bit, yeah. I do quite a lot of this just at home with my own objects. I think that's quite an interesting starting point. And you kind of have to clear a bit of a room, get some decent lighting, maybe, you know, I would use my iPhone, but kind of, I think it's often in the documentation, you know, where we can really bring our ideas to life, so controlling those variables. But I think, you know, for me, it's really interesting to just get a group of objects, organize and classify them, and then to understand, you know, what are the narratives that we can see, tell, and communicate with this group. So I would just go as low-fi as possible to start, and then see how we can kind of document those, share those with others, and perhaps build up a body of practice with that. But, you know, I like, you know, raiding the children's toy cupboards. The pound store is also a really familiar point of call for us. But I think that's a really interesting challenge, is how do we think about sustainability in the materials that we use and the experimentation that we do. It's very easy to run these workshops and suddenly by the end of them you've got a mound of, you know, stuff that really I think we need to kind of work a little bit smarter in our own practice to try and make these, you know, activities that are fun, exciting, engaging, but how can they also be sustainable in terms of the use of materials?
I think that's a great note to end on. Henrietta, thank you so much for your time for this wonderful talk and for being here today.